There we go.
Test. Oh, okay. Cool. I feel way more powerful now. So I want to talk about technologies for virtual worlds. And the hook here is that technology is not a linear progression. It is not the case that we push everything at the same speed. It is more the case that we discover specific branches of the technological tree, and when they get traction as being useful for a specific industry or for a specific art scene here, I mean, virtual worlds is not really an art scene anymore. It's more like a huge industry. When these technologies become useful, there is almost like a virtuous loop where capital and talent is being invested into them, and they grow towards a logical conclusion. So one example is networking. What started as single-player games and worlds where players were in their own bespoke reality quickly grew to peer-to-peer networking, where people were able to engage in session-based games together, all the way to almost their logical conclusion, which is server-client-based architecture that are always on and resistant to adversarial actors. But that thing did not happen just because. It was not on the linear progression. It happened because early on, there was some traction in some ideas, and there was like a lot of effort that was put into these. It's almost like an evolutionary tree, you know, like when insects got their wings for the first time, it was almost impossible to not keep pushing on the wings. The wings were too good. Same thing with networking. Same thing with visual fidelity as well. What started as text on the screen evolved to sprites moving around, 3D, and now we're almost at kind of like the logical conclusion of it, where ray tracing is approaching nature and what it looks like. Same thing with content, right? Like what started as no content at all evolved to dialogues on the screen, map editors, procedural generation, and now you don't even understand your designer anymore. It's just making stuff for you. So for all of these, there was essentially almost like an inflection point at the beginning when people realized like, oh man, like that is actually really powerful. And then the virtuous loop kicked in. But again, it is not linear. It is not the case that we go along this and discover everything that has to be discovered, push them to their logical extreme, and then say, okay, we're done, we can move to the next step. There are like very intentional decisions that are being made there on what to explore. And so one kind of like obvious question is, are there more branches? Are there places that we just forgot about or did not explore? Are there secrets, basically? Secrets are quite nice because they give people a big edge when they're the first one to know about the secrets, but they also make life a little bit more interesting. If technology was just a big linear kind of like progression, we would just all be kind of like kicking around and doing the same thing. And if you sit down and you think a little bit about, okay, what makes virtual worlds fair, alive, persistence, good for their inhabitants, independent? All of these things, which are very important when you build a virtual world, they don't sit neatly on the tech tree, right? Like a lot of people would say, oh, this is a matter of good design or a good community. But there's no real technology you can work on that directly correlates to improvement there. And what I want to explore today is like, maybe there is. Maybe there was something that got created 14, 15 years ago that flew under the radar because it got bundled with different kinds of incentives that we might not like that can provide essentially improvement on this axis. Right? If you think about, okay, what makes secure, contain, protect, EVE Online, MUDs, Blazeball, and all of these things so good doesn't fit neatly here, right? Like, and again, the kind of like easy way to explain it is, oh, those were just like design improvements, you know, like they just got the design and the community right. But what if there is some technology we can push there to make things feel more alive? And so my kind of like ask from you folks is to suspend disbelief when I talk about aliveness. It's really hard. Let's just ask like Heidegger or any German philosopher to talk about the word or aliveness or whatever in a way that makes sense. So every time I mention something like that, you know, like a word or aliveness or whatever, just like picture whatever you want in your mind. It's like, oh yeah, like that's good. I've experienced this thing on the internet and it felt alive. But like, don't ask me to define it because it's basically impossible. Like you have to go to a 4-year class with Heidegger to even understand what he means by being in the world. So, and we only have 45 minutes. There's this quote from Yancheng, an artist that builds worlds that don't have players, is just machines inhabiting in them and doing a bunch of stuff. And he has this quote from his book, which I really like, which he defines a world as a future you can believe in. One that promises to survive its creator and continue generating drama. And so from this perspective, if we were to want to create technology that allows a world to have a future, what would we do, right? And what I want to talk about today is the idea of ownerless computing, right? How do we build computers that don't have any owner, right? Like, how do we build computers that can live a life of their own, treat everybody equally, have no God mode access, and essentially see it as a genuinely new type of technology on the tech tree? I put it there. It's kind of early. I think the tragedy with ownerless computing, as I'll explain later, is that it has been bundled with a bunch of very nasty stuff very early on, almost as path dependency. But it can be treated as a standalone thing. Just like computer graphics is something you can isolate from a product and push on as technology, ownerless computing is kind of the same thing. And it was invented 14 years ago, and it was immediately bundled with capitalism, basically. People were like, wow, like we can build computers that are unstoppable. What are we going to do with that? We're going to make a bank. We're gonna build a really strong type of money, you know, like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, all of that. But if you open the box on these, it's 99% extremely fancy cryptography and distributed system technology and 1% libertarian ideologies, essentially. And now what's happening is, through mimetism, every single new thing that comes out here just inherits the original like political implications of what these things were in the first place. And I want you to kind of like think about them as rockets and not guns. When gunpowder was invented, you can kind of trace modern rocketry all the way back to gunpowders. Rocketry might bring us to other planets, which would be a watershed moment for human civilization. It would be pretty dope. If you don't like rockets, just come up with something else where it was used in a bad way. But, you know, gunpowder also enabled modern warfare, right? The first people that got huge cannons kind of like wrecked everybody else on the sea, and it led to it's one of the reasons we had this explosion of violence here. So I claim that ownerless computing and cryptocurrencies is kind of like rocket and guns. You know, you can open the technology up and take really interesting stuff from there, but you don't necessarily have to go all the way to, oh, this is just an engine of hyper-financialization. So this is what I just said. If you take ownerless compute, you bundle it with like, here, let's build a ledger with libertarian ideals, you get Bitcoin. And people think this is the innovation. People think, okay, like the innovation is Bitcoin, and we're just going to make Bitcoin-like things. We're going to make NFTs, hyper-financialization, scam, all of that. But fundamentally, the technology is this. Is the fact that we can build computers that are not owned by anyone. Logical computers that exist, that are kind of like, that remain alive from like a network of people that collaborate and make it exist. But that's the real innovation, right? And so one way we can define it is that it's a distributed logical computer made alive and autonomous by human coordination. Human coordination can be accomplished in many different ways. One of the reasons why these ownerless computers use money is because money is basically liquid incentives, and it's the fastest way to get people to do stuff across the internet. But there are plenty of other ways to do this as well, right? Some of you folks build virtual worlds. You know that humans go through great pain to participate in these experiments without being paid at all. So there's a lot of incentives that is already being created today without capital. You can call it blockchain computing. You can call it sovereign computing. It doesn't really matter how you call it. It matters if you go talk to people outside, because they will anchor very specifically on what you say, and it will be bundled by a bunch of like hypotheses on why this or this is not useful. But for the sake of this conversation, let's just say ownerless computing. And a bunch of claim about it is that it doesn't require proof of work and spending 1% of Earth electricity on computing stupid hashes. It doesn't require a token, doesn't require hyper-financialization, speculation, scams. All of these things were kind of bundled with it. The same way, okay, I'm not going to say that, but the same way a bunch of very nasty stuff got bundled with the internet very early on. But the internet is a neutral technology. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be responsible about what happens with the technology. Like, responsible technologists should build things and also follow up with like what to do with them. But it is not the case that this is bound to be forever an engine of hyper-financialization. The technology is pretty general. And so, and I claim that bundling onerous computing with financialization has basically been the greatest computing tragedy of the 21st century. This is genuinely one of the most interesting things that is happening from the perspective of distributed system and cryptography, which it literally leveled up from many different perspectives, the mathematics even that we use when we talk about cryptography, but it got kind of like drawn into this, I mean, one way I like to talk about it is if this whole industry goes bad, at the very least, the floor of its impact is that it created a fly trap for most psychopaths in the 21st century, and it kind of like got stuck there. So in the end, it might have been a little bit useful, but yeah, the kind of like the feedback loop here has been really interesting. One note here is maybe it had to be done this way. A lot of technology is very path dependent on what happened. So I don't know, maybe it had to be done this way. But it is not the case anymore that we should just like shelve that forever. One of the great tragedy of modern science, and specifically energy, is that there was this whole movement around cold fusion in the 80s. A bunch of people had reproducible experiments on here's how we do fusion, but without massive amount of heat and energy. And a bunch of like old scientists came in and said, oh, this is bullshit. And then they just shelved it and nobody ever worked on this again. And to this day, we still don't know whether it would actually have worked. So it's kind of like really dangerous from like many perspectives to shelf technology because of its early impact and its early scene and never revisit it ever again. So I know for sure that this is going to be revisited over and over again. But one thing I kind of want to bring to this audience is how do we bring this technology outside of its context and start using it for other things, starting from virtual worlds, right? So know what? This whole speed around like, okay, guys, you might have shelved blockchain in your mind as like something extremely dumb, and I'm trying to like open the box again and say, actually, there's a lot of really interesting there. What do we do with that, right? So what do we do if we have an ownerless computer? What do we do if we have a computer that doesn't need their parents anymore and can just like live a life of their own? And if we go back to Yan Sheng's quote early on about the fact that worlds are future you can believe in, I'll make the claim that the thing that worlds want the most on the internet is they want autonomy, right? For something to feel real on the internet, there is this feeling of like, oh, this thing is autonomous, this thing has a life of its own. It's not a theme park, you know? It's not a theme park that is controlled by some form of groups of players or corporation or whatever that changes at the whim of its creator. It's its own thing. So it's almost like, you know, you have the, in psychology, you have a lot of like adult development curve. Like most virtual worlds are stuck in the childhood phase where they like really hate their parents and they're stuck into this like controlled thing. So how do we make them go through teenagehood and then through adulthood? And the way, can you see this? Oh man, it's too dark. Okay, autonomous world is one of the terms that the art scene I'm part of has been using in order to refer to these worlds that run on ownerless compute. And I'll go through one of the definition of this and what it means and a case study and all of that. But the thing to remember so far is that there is such a thing as a group of people that is trying to use this technology away from its hyper-financialization in order to try to invent fundamentally new types of virtual world. This is like the main takeaway so far. And the definition of an autonomous world, or AW, is that, and I'll go through each of these, but it has strong diegetic boundary. It has like formal introduction rules, and most importantly, it doesn't need any privileged individual in order to keep it alive. It just needs some people to keep believing in it. It doesn't need its J.K. Rowling or Blizzard, you know, to remain alive. What I mean by strong diegetic boundary is that you can think of a world as like a world needs a boundary. A world has to separate what is inside the world and is accepted as real and what is not. And the word diegetic essentially means in the world. So as an example, if you watch a sitcom and there's like people laughing and clapping, that's non-diegetic. It doesn't actually happen in the universe of the people in the sitcom. But if someone is playing music on like, I don't know, a speaker in the world and the characters hear it, it's diegetic. So if you think about the diegetic boundary, a strong diegetic boundary means that for all inhabitants in the world, or at least most of them that are sane, it is very clear what is in the world and what is not in the world. So something that would not have a strong diegetic boundary would be fan fictions, right? If you have a fan fiction system, it's up to constant arguing whether something is legit or not. You know, it's like, and it's actually a feature that the diegetic boundary is weak, right? So if you have a bunch of stuff that is out of the world actually considered in the world for some people or vice versa, that's what we would say. That's something we would say has weak diegetic boundary. So one of the property of autonomous world is they have a very strong diegetic boundary, and the reason is it's just code. It's just a bunch of rules that define what is in the world and what is not in the world. Furthermore, this code is just available for everyone to read, and every single person that inhabits the world actually runs the code and verifies that it's the case. So if you play World of Warcraft, you have no idea what the diegetic boundary is. If like an intern one day just drops a table and a bunch of stuff disappears and doesn't tell anyone, then the diegetic boundary has been broken. There is no way for anyone to verify this. There is no kind of like deep belief that this is being maintained as a property. And so because this boundary is defined with math and code, and it lets the inhabitants of the world essentially deal with the rest, how does the world look like? What are our social contracts on what to do with it and stuff like that? It allows this world to, the world doesn't require any form of permission individual anymore to be able to come in and be like, this is acceptable, this is not. Or like, actually, we're going to nerf this because it's way too powerful. There is a stability that comes from the fact that these rules have been set in stone and are essentially verified by everybody that takes part in the world. Another property is that they have formal introduction rule. This is basically the same thing as the previous one, but this one is more like the cause, is that in order to bring something in the world, it has to happen through a formalized process. So it could be code, it could be mathematics, but it should be as objective as possible, because the nice thing with objectivity is you can scale to more people that inhabits the world. If we did not have physics and we were all extremely high on LSD right now, it would be really hard to decide what is real and what is not. But we have this like base level of reality that we're all partaking in that allows us to build civilizations on top of something that is very stable as a set of rules. And also, it doesn't require any privileged individual. So it runs, like if you're a developer, you can think of it as it runs on ownerless computer. It doesn't run on AWS, on Azure, or on your own on-prem servers somewhere. It runs on this logical computers that are powered by human coordination. And this gives it the property that they don't need any privileged individual. Anyway, let's go through a case study. So a bunch of these things have been built over the last 4 or 5 years. They've had some players. It's still very much an art scene right now, if you think about it from the scale of who is involved. But there's already a bunch of really interesting things that happened that I believe is a direct consequence of what the technology is in the first place. So there is this word called dark forest that I helped develop a couple of years ago. So dark forest looks like this. I mean, this is one of the clients, because one of the things that's important with autonomous world is the only thing that is formalized is the rules. It's not how you perceive the world, or at least not yet. And what dark forest is a real-time strategy game in space where you move energy between planets and you capture them and you build your empire. The only thing that is defined in dark forest that all the players are essentially buying into are the rules, and everything else is up to them, right? So I'll go through examples of like what players did with that. So first version was in 2019. It runs entirely on ownerless computing. It was actually the first time a game was running entirely on these systems. We had 10,000 players-ish per round that would last a week. And people made hundreds of extensions and things like this. And I'll explain why this is fundamentally different from mods. We don't really have a good name for these yet, but they feel very different. So Dark Forest, one of the key mechanics of Dark Forest is that just like other real-time strategy games, it relies on information asymmetry. So not everybody can see the whole universe. But the thing that is particularly interesting there is that it creates information asymmetry with extremely modern cryptography called zero-knowledge proofs. It doesn't create information asymmetry via servers. So there are true secrets in Dark Forest. It is not the case that there is someone operating a bunch of servers that is like, actually, I can see where everything is, but I'm just hiding it respectively to the players. It is the case there are things in the universe that nobody can observe. Understanding how this works is like a whole lecture again, but you'll just have to believe me on this. But it uses these zero-knowledge proofs, which are kind of like the next big improvement in cryptography. So we call it programmable cryptography. And what this allows is to essentially say, hey, players, in order to discover the universe, have to use computational power. So they just let their computer run for a very long time, say, I want to explore this. And their computer is going to find out what the structures are there. And then they can prove to essentially the distributed game server that the moves they're making are correct. So they're saying, hey, I'm moving from this planet to this planet. Nobody has any idea where these planets are, but I'm making a mathematical proof that this move is valid. It fits within my energy requirements. These planets exist and stuff like that. At the time, the technology was not that good, so we had to go with this kind of like, oh, your computer has to do some work in order to explore the universe. If we were to do this again today, we would just say, hey, you have a spaceship and you have to go somewhere to explore, and it takes time for you to explore there. But the thing that is interesting is this world has true secrets. It is not the case that someone created the map, saved it somewhere, and then like selectively reveals it to players. The map just exists, kind of like Mars. Like we don't know what's there. And there is no need for like some form of, that we know of, some form of God to kind of like maintain the secrecy and respectively reveal it to the people that go. And that's like, to go back to what I was saying about words being alive and feeling real and blah, 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 it's like, this to me points again at the fact like, when we have this idea of ownerless computing, there's a bunch of technology that need to be built in order to like make them work with the design we would like to have. As an example, information asymmetry, that makes the world feel more real, right? Like if I'm building a virtual world, I mean, if I had to choose between true secrets and fake secrets, I would probably choose true secrets. It's like, it's cooler. It feels more real. You know, it's not the case that someone made it, it's just there. And same thing, it was ownerless, always up. So we didn't have to do any DevOps for Dark Forest. Actually, Dark Forest is still running today. There's no way for us to shut it down. It just exists. It's just a thing on the internet. And you can think of it as unexplored land on the internet with its own rules, with its own secrets, and without any owner. It was client agnostic. So what this means is that the thing that appears on the player's screen is not canonical. They can build whatever representation layer makes sense for them. We built one, and some of the art we use for planets kind of became canonical. But these things were two different things. The same way I have no idea what your folks' qualia is when you look at me. Like, I might be a different color, actually. I have no idea. But the thing that puts us together in the same reality are physical laws, right? So it's the same here. There is no way to impose a qualia on a specific player, but at the very least, they all share the same rules. And they're all treated the same way. One funny thing in Dark Forest is there is no difference between humans and machines. So people built a bunch of machines that did things, and this boundary became really complicated and kind of political between the players and the machines. All changes in Dark Forest came with a mathematical proof. So built on crazy numbers, you could check that, hey, actually, this person is making a move very far away, but I know I can convince myself that it's real. I don't have to ask some form of authority, hey, is this correct? The same way if you make an API request to Facebook and it gives you the social graph of someone, you just have to take it at face value. Here, it's not the case. It's basically built on modern mathematics, and it had true secrets. And what I'm writing here is what you see is not the world. That's my point around client agnosticity. Don't anchor too much on this. This doesn't matter. This is just one thing that exists out there on how to represent the world, but it is not the world. The world is the rules. Another thing that was quite interesting from Dark Forest is that because these ownerless computers actually, and I'll talk about it later, through their history have the best multiplayer computing stack, they have the best infrastructure and tooling when it comes to having a computer that is open to many people. So kind of one question here if you're a developer is, how would you build a multi-user database where multiple people, possibly adversarial with each other, can access a database, make their own records, query other people's record without modifying them? That's a lot of technology that you need to build. All databases today are just based on permissioning. There is some code that is written by the developers that can touch the database in God mode, and then the rest of the world has to interface with the database through this middleware. When you have ownerless computers, you can't do that. You have to build a lot of stuff, all the way from virtual machines to programming languages to tooling that makes it such that the computer can be used by many people at the same time that might possibly not like each other. So now you need to do things here's a line on the ground between my programs and your programs, and you do your thing and I do my thing, but we're not going to interface with each other. So because out of necessity, these computers are really good at multiplayer computing. And so what happened in Dark Forest is one mental model, players were able to upload code in the server. It's not a server, but it's a good mental model. They were able to take some code, and it's not plugins. It's not I'm modifying my World of Warcraft user interface. It's not mods. Mods are fractured reality. You take a reality, you change it, and you make a new one. This is literally deploying code and deploying technology into an existing world. And the way these new things that players have made interface with other players is that they all need to respect the same rules. Because as I said earlier, code, machine, and humans are all treated the same way in this universe. So what's written up there is mods. So basically, I claim mods that create fractured reality, whereas extensions are built within reality. And so this is one of the example, Project Sophon, that was built by a bunch of players in Dark Forest. So Dark Forest has these rules that allows players to broadcast one planet per day, and broadcasting essentially reveals the location of a planet to all players. You know how I said at the beginning that you have to explore the universe in Dark Forest? Well, on top of that, players can just broadcast a planet. It's based on the three-body problem books from UC Shin, if you've read it. They can just broadcast the location of a planet, not everybody knows about it. And so some folks were like, hey, I actually would like some planets to be broadcasted, and I don't know where they are. So they would be able to go see in the game, there's this prize planet somewhere. I have no idea where it is, but I would like it to be broadcasted. And they created a marketplace where people can say like, hey, I'll pay you if you broadcast the planet. But the thing that is interesting is this doesn't require like some form of escrow on a forum or for us to like give them an API key. They just made this. And anyone that can read the code of this extension can convince themselves that actually, if I reveal the planet and the list there, I'm going to be rewarded for this. So it essentially accelerates collaboration between players because they don't have to rely on trust with other intermediaries. Moreover, when this was deployed by the players, it was there. They just didn't have control over it anymore. It was just a thing that was added to reality. Another one is night market. It's kind of similar to the broadcast market, but with even crazier cryptography. So that allowed people to sell locations of planets to each other in an encrypted way. So imagine an information marketplace, the most cyberpunk thing you can imagine on the internet, where players would be like, hey, I know where this planet is, and I can prove it to you with a mathematical proof. A player would be like, I really want to buy the location of this planet because it's a treasure planet and I would like to go there. And they were able to engage into trustless exchanges with each other without an intermediary, not even us. Like, it's not like we were running the server and be like, we're actually the secret escrow between these players. They were able to communicate and create these exchanges on their own, right? So same thing, pretty similar to Sophon. Of course, they built a lot of marketplaces because one of the things we did is we made it such that things can be transferred to each other, but we never built a marketplace on purpose because we're like, someone is going to build the marketplace, right? This is what happens all the time. And these marketplaces, compared to the illegal marketplaces of online worlds today, they were able to operate very well because they were not relying on like, oh, put your login there, then meet me there and drop the gold on the floor and pick it up. They were just able to do the thing that respects the physics, right? One thing we added is that it's impossible for people to transfer planet ownership if they're not close to each other. Because otherwise the classic trick is you send someone to the other edge of the galaxy, you transfer your planet, and then you've basically teleported. We created a strong kind of like speed of light limit. And so people were not able to actually build planet marketplaces that made it such that people can transfer planets from extremely far away. So you see, people can deploy code in the server. They can extend the world, but they still have to respect the rules. This is my favorite. I was dreaming of this thing. I was like, someone has to make this, and they did. This is the Astral Colossus. It doesn't look like much. This is just a leaderboard of who helped the Astral Colossus. But you can think of it basically as a Lovecraftian horror in a virtual world. This is an ownerless NPC that goes around and bully people, and if you don't give it power, it just will wipe you out. And it just keeps roaming the galaxy and doing stuff, and nobody controls it. It's truly a non-playable character that has a life of its own, that was made by players, almost released like a virus, and that has just been living in this universe. And it's still there. You can still screw around with the Astral Colossus. And that's pretty interesting, because if this were to happen in a traditional game with like, well, not traditional game, but in a game that doesn't use onerous computing, there's always the possibility that, but what if the person that runs this just like takes all the money or like doesn't do it, right? What if they just disappear one day? The stability of the claim, the credible commitment to the fact that this is going to remain around and execute as it's supposed to execute is extremely strong. Cool, okay. That was a wild ride. What does it mean? Like, how do we get practical with this thing? What does it mean from the perspective of like IP, fairness, technology? What can you do with this stuff? So the first thing I want to make as a claim is that it's all server technology. It has nothing to do with rendering, content, monetization, whatever, but it's not a trivial change in the server, right? So if you have World of Warcraft, basically it runs on C++ and Blizzard's legal operation and cash flow. It's not just C++. If Blizzard runs out of money, this dies, right? So, I mean, you have private servers and all of that, but let's say the vanilla servers. So this is the backend for World of Warcraft. If you swap it for distributed network and consensus, it doesn't change the thing you experience on the screen, right? So that's why I say it's a server technology. But it's not a trivial change, right? If I were to replace C++ with Java, it would also be a server change, but it has far less reaching impact. Maybe it would just run slower, but it would have way less impact than this one, right? So it's a very deep and meaningful server change. And to illustrate this, imagine a banking app. This is like your run-of-the-mill neobank. They put ads on the metro in the underground, like, oh, get a new bank account there. And it's backed by the Swift banking system, and it's protected by the FSCS, right? So now let's swap the backend to my little brother in my garage with a Google spreadsheet. It's still the same thing, but it's a fundamentally different thing now, even if it's just a backend change. If you swap it again with the Bitcoin network, which has been going for 14 years without a hiccup and never done anything that was not supposed to do. It's, again, a fundamentally different thing. So these server changes are meaningful, and they change the relationship that people have with the application in the first place. So it's almost a new kind of server. It's not just here's faster server blades, RAM disk, Azure Giga machines of whatever. It's a new kind of server. And a bunch of interesting things with that, also from a very kind of like business perspective, that A, there's no one to go bankrupt. If a company goes bankrupt, if we go bankrupt, Dark Forest doesn't care. It's still around. As long as at least one person believes in Dark Forest, it's going to keep running and maintain its integrity. You don't have DDoS attack. That's a nice one. You have no infrastructure cost. We spend literally $0 on Dark Forest infrastructure. The players just run it because they care about it. There's no DevOps. There is a relational is a wrong word there, but there is a difference in the relationship that people have with these servers compared to traditional servers. Another really interesting property is that it's multiplayer computing built out of necessity. So as I said earlier, if you were tasked with the exercise of building a multi-user database, that would be a new fundamentally type of database, right? So here, if you compare a theme park with a city needs to build very different kind of infrastructure from a theme park out of necessity. It is the case that a theme park could have an election and a mayor and all of that, but they don't have to do it. It's perfectly possible for a theme park to run on complete totalitarian control. That's actually what it is, right? Whereas a city needs, out of necessity, to build very different type of infrastructure. And so, similarly, if you have a computer that is open to everybody on the internet, there is this kind of like path dependency where a lot of technology is built in order to make this multiplayer. And it is possible to do it with traditional computers. So EVE Online is kind of famous for its really broad APIs and like third-party developer ecosystem and stuff like that. But they didn't build it out of necessity. They just added it over time because they thought it was cool. The thing that is nice with Dark Forest is it comes with all of this on day one. Actually, probably the best multiplayer computing stack that exists today. And what this means is that the world is default extensible. And it's not mods, like you can have mods. It's not, oh, let me take Dark Forest and change the speed of every player and now make a new world and convince players to come on my new world. It's about creating things on top of the existing world. And a way to illustrate this is my tale of tennis and driving. So if I am playing tennis with a friend next to a road and someone is driving a car, we're both kind of like being anchored in the same fundamental reality. That is where the rules are determined by modern physics. I'm playing a game and I have my own kind of like magic circle around me. I'm playing tennis with my friends, we count the points and all of that. Someone else is driving their car, they're playing driving, which is not an easy game actually. But if the car starts like sliding around because there's some water and crashing the core and stop our game, or two things were able to interface with each other, even if we never agreed on like an IP agreement or legal agreement on how these two things should be able to interact with each other, because they're both based on the same underlying rules. So the thing that is interesting here is that players, and basically anyone, can build things that, as long as they respect the rules, are default interoperable with each other. It is not the case that they need to apply to a developer program and get their thing accepted in order to like, oh, do this there. The world can go at much faster speed when it comes to innovation because people just have to respect the rules. And so an example of this is we built this recently. It's basically a shameless clone of Minecraft, a very bad one as well, on an enormous computer. And players did the thing they always do. They started building crazy stuff. But at some point, there's this rule in this game we built where in order to make it such that people don't just come and break the stuff you created, you can take diamonds you mined in this world and stake it in specific chunks in order to protect them. So whoever has staked the most amount of diamond in a chunk has right access to it. So if I put like 100 diamonds on my house, well, unless someone shows up with 101 diamond, they can't break it down. Like very simple system for protecting things. And what happened is some person just claimed the whole spawn. They mined 100,000 diamonds and claimed the whole spawn. But then something interesting happened. They tweeted, they're like, the game has now changed. As you may already have seen, the chunks around the spawn has been claimed by me, the supreme leader of OPCraft. But it did something really interesting where they actually deployed a bunch of code and extension into this computer in order to build a communist revolution. So players were able to essentially join the communist revolution in exchange for transferring the entire inventory to this new kind of like meta inventory, and their inventory would be replaced by the Republic's inventory. So they were able to build together on the land that was collectively claimed. And this is not like a guild that says like, oh, this is our rule on our Discord. You have to drop all your inventory on the floor, and then someone is going to pick it up and they'll let you access the chest. This was built on top of the rules because there was nothing that was preventing players from sharing inventory. So someone was able to create this dynamic on top, and anyone was able to read the code and be like, actually, you know, like if I read this, or like if I ask my friends if I can't read code to read these 50 lines of code, it makes sense, right? What it says is just give inventory, get new shared inventory, and then you're able to build on top of the big Republic land. And it allowed them to essentially build beautiful monument, including the pixelated face of the supreme leader. So it was quite interesting. They were able to scale coordination very, very quickly without breaking any rule by deploying code inside the server. And again, the reason they could do that is because there is extremely strong agreement around what is and what is not in the world. And as long as you do things that are in the world, you're fine. There's no one to agree on that. There's no curation, moderation, whatever. And by the way, this can be a curse. No moderation is kind of interesting, right? One way to think about moderation and all of that is that if you give, or at least a thesis, if you give to players the tool to remove the things they don't like, maybe they will do it. You know, like if there is, because the worst kind of bad content is bad content no one can remove. You know, if someone types in the chat something horrible and people don't have mod access to remove things in the chat, then there's this whole thing that happens where everybody's seeing that. But imagine a chat that you can just mine, like in Minecraft. People can just break the stuff they don't like. Would they create some form of social contracts on top of it to remove the things they don't like? I don't know. But at the very least, the thing that is interesting with strong diegetic boundaries is that it comes as a blessing and as a curse. Curse because there is no way to do moderation. Blessing because it gives the tools to anyone to kind of like regulate what's happening there through coordination. Another interesting property of this system is the longevity and the fairness. So the fairness comes from the fact that because people agree on the rule, it's essentially treating everybody the same way. There is no, oh, like actually, I am a friend of the CEO and I'm getting 1 million gems in my mobile game because they just edited the database. Or, oh, here's, I don't know, through nepotism, this happened to me. It's kind of interesting also from the perspective of treating humans and machines the same way. We kind of have a crisis right now where machines are getting pretty good. And we're questioning what it means to be human on the internet, at least at a very shallow level. At a deep level, if you have a conversation with a loved one, there's major difference between that and a poor kind of like copy of their persona from a large language model. But from the perspective of doing cheap labor on the internet, these are kind of like converging, right? So I think that the fact that these worlds treat machines and humans in the same way is probably going to accelerate bot-aware design. Today, I think a lot of things that happen in the traditional gaming industry for virtual war is that people are just rejecting the bots. They're like, let's build as many protections as we can in order to not get the bots because our design is not bot-aware. For Dark Forest, we're not claiming it was a good design, but at the very least, it didn't completely break down when bots happened because the metagame of Dark Forest was basically diplomacy. Because there was so much tool that was given to the players in order to automate, create alliances and stuff like that, that the ultimate metagame of Dark Forest was not bot-friendly at all. It was just literally meeting in person and making diplomatic decisions. That's what happened. So there's this interesting thing where if you make your world bot-aware, which you have to with these systems, maybe through kind of like a evolutionary selection process, we'll find good designs for this. Okay, really quick side note about what it means for something to be a credible commitment, because I make the claim that these words are credibly fair. They make a credible commitment to fairness. They don't say, they show up at Gamescom and like, we're going to be fair to everybody. That's not a credible commitment. The only credibility behind this commitment is the reputation of the person that makes the commitment. The thing that is interesting here is it's a credible commitment from the perspective of mathematics and computing. There's literally like a commitment that is being done with code, and people know that unless 2/3 of the players decide to run a different code, this is going to happen for sure. So it's a really different kind of commitment. And people talk about these in psychology from the perspective of commitment device. So things like legal contract, accountability partners, all of these are tools that humans use in order to make credible commitments. But here the nice thing is ownerless computing gives you credible commitments from the perspective of code. And they make a very strong commitment that something will happen. Right? And this commitment is protected by people participating or capital that is used for the proof-of-stake system. It depends on how your consensus is being done, right? As an example, if you had a multiplayer game where the consensus is just, if you screw up with the rules as someone that participated in the war, your account would just be wiped by the other players. These credible commitments are essentially backed by how much people care about their accounts. So there is now a new system that allows the game to make credible commitment as to what will happen. Treating people fairly, stopping on a Sunday, never being upgraded, all of these things. Cool. And it gives credible equality amongst the inhabitants. Another thing that I found is a profound difference is that inhabiting the world entails verifying its execution. When you boot up your computer and you load Dark Forest and you like build some little infrastructure around it, you're essentially verifying that Dark Forest is executing the right way. You're convincing yourself that in order to see what's like the thing pop up on your screen, that the computer was like, thumbs up, human, this is executing the way you think it should execute. It's not just you downloading a bunch of data and believing that this is the case. One last very small section, and then we'll end here. So I want to talk a little bit about the scene. Who are these people? Like, who makes these things? Who plays these things? Why is it interesting? So these people are pretty organized, actually. I'm part of them. I'm an organized human being. I made this whole deck at 3 a.m. yesterday. They run symposiums. We actually have pretty big traditional game developer show up. So EVE Online is very interested in all of this. There are multidisciplinary artists, designers that are all kind of like interested in this fringe art scene. They run hackathons. They made a book where they wrote a bunch of stuff that sound kind of insane if you read it, but maybe is the start of a fringe art scene. Some early infrastructure is emerging that allows these projects to be built faster. And like in terms of stats, I would say it's 50-ish team. There's 100 million plus capital that was invested in technology for building these. You know, capitalists today have a hard time figuring out where to put their money. So they're just trying to figure out what comes next. So there is kind of like an abundance of capital there, which might not be a good thing, but it's some form of signal for some people. And the thing I find the most interesting is people are mostly building clones of things that already exist. So it's very early skeuomorphism. You know, when you have a medium, as an example, like there's this semi-apocryphal story where when the first year of television, when it was distributed in people's home, the main thing that was on television, it was people filming radio shows. Because they had no idea, like someone still hadn't invented editing. Like someone sit down 1 year after television and was like, if I put a picture of a gravestone and then a picture of a human face, people will understand that this person is dead. So editing and putting different things next to each other was also an invention, but it happened after television were widely distributed, or at least cinemas, which are a very janky form of television. So they're still in the early skeuomorphism stage, and what they do is they mostly port things that exist to these medium and try to see what happens. And the funny thing is they're always surprised by what happens. It's not just moving it from C++ to Java. When we did the Minecraft clone, we were really surprised by the Supreme Leader because we're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's a property of the new medium. And it's growing pretty fast, not from the perspective of players playing these games. There's no one playing these games. It's mostly people it's mostly the art scene. The art scene plays each other's game and is like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But there's a pretty good like pipeline of talent and intellectual raw power getting in. So it's quite interesting, but again, still an art scene. Okay, so why did I tell you all of this? Well, I think that we need more designers and agile, experienced teams to come through these things. The thing that is interesting is it being an art scene, it always starts with very kind of like naive people that, oh no, it's my last slide, promise. It always starts with very naive people that are very idealist. So one thing that has been interesting is bringing people that have spent a lot of time developing games in virtual world into this, getting them to be agile enough to reprogram their head around like, oh, here's what matters, here's what doesn't matter, and helping and get them to bring like essentially experience. The disclaimer is it touches some part of the crypto scene, so you're gonna get really bad signal to noise ratio. Actually, if you Google autonomous world on the internet and you go to a bunch of these things, you might be very surprised by the kind of conversation you hear there and the difference with all that I've told you today. So you need your guide, but to me, it's the cost you have to pay to get access to the technology right now. When you have an early scene, there's no like stable leaders that can tell you what is right or what is incorrect. There is no good conference or text on the matter. So it's pretty janky, but it's there. Thank you. And that's my email address if you want to send me an email, and this is my Twitter. Thanks. All right.